Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Isnaeni Hidayanti here. I want to explain about the hypothesis in quantitative research. The hypothesis would rate culturally disadvantaged children who have had preschool training achieve at a higher level in first grade than culturally disadvantaged children who do not have preschool training. You can see that the hypothesis related the variables of preschool training and first grade achievement. Students who have complete a unit on problem-solving strategy will score higher on a student on a standardized mathematics test than those who have complete a control unit. Middle school students who have previously taken music lesson will have higher math aptitude score. Middle school students who have siblings will be more popular among their peers than students who do not have siblings. Deriving hypothesis inductively. The inductive procedure is a particular fruitful source of hypothesis for classroom teacher. Teacher observe learning and other student behavior every day and try to relate it to their own behavior, to the behavior of other students, to the teaching methods used, to change in the school environment, and so on. After reflecting on such experience, teacher might inductively formulate generalizations that seek to explain the observed relationship between their methods and materials and student learning. This tentative explanation of what things happen as they do can become the hypothesis in empirical investigation. Deriving hypothesis deductively. A hypothesis derived from a theory is known as deductive hypothesis. After choosing a theory of interest, you use deductive reasoning to arrive at a logical consequence of the theory. One could investigate this hypothesis by examining the change over time in the academic self-concept of gifted students in homogeneous classes compared to that of much gifted students placed in regular heterogeneous classes. And then, relationship between variables. A hypothesis should conjecture the relationship between two or more variables. Achievement motivation people have a tendency to strive for success and to choose goal-oriented success or failure activity. There is a positive relationship between achievement, motivation, and success in school.
Hello everyone, my name is Elysa Nuryani Markhamah. You can call me Elysa. Here I wanted to be continued about explained by Isna, and I wanted to start of cognitive dissonance theory. Requiring middle school students who smoke to write an essay on why young people should not smoke will change their attitudes about smoking. Vygotsky's theory of learning cognitive development is strongly linked to input from other people. Tutoring by more able peers will have a positive effect on the learning of at-risk students. Maslow's human needs theory. And then children from economically disadvantaged homes who are given breakfast at school will show higher achievement than similar students not given breakfast. Behaviorism behavior that is positively reinforced will increase in strength, and on-text behavior will increase when teacher positively reinforce it. No proposed relationship to tests. And then a hypothesis must be testable. If the hypothesis is on target, then certain predicatable research should be manifest. A testable hypothesis enables the researcher to determine by observations and data collections whether consequences they are deductively implied actually occur. Otherwise, it will be impossible either to confirm or not to confirm the hypothesis. If no means are available for measuring the variables, then no one could gather the data necessary to test the validity of the hypothesis. Unless you can specifically define the indicators of each variable and subsequently can measure these variables, and you cannot test the hypothesis. The indicators of the variables are referred to as operational definitions. Recall from chapter 2 that variables are operationally defined by specifying the steps the investigator takes to measure the variable. And then with the existing body of knowledge, the hypothesis like my car will not start because the fluid in the battery has changed to gold. This satisfies the first two criteria but is so contrary to what is known about the nature of matter that you would not pursue it. The hypothesis like the car will not start because the fluid in the battery has evaporated to a low level, and this is consistent with previous knowledge and therefore is worth pursuing. It will probably be unprofitable to hypothesis and absence of relationship between the self-concepts of adolescent boys and girls and the rate of physically growth because the preponderance of evidence supports the presence of such a relationship. And then the null hypothesis. You must first state a null hypothesis and assess the probability that this null hypothesis is true. The null hypothesis is a statistical hypothesis. It is called the null hypothesis because it states that there is no relationship between the variables in the populations. A null hypothesis states a negation of what the experimenter expect or predict. A researcher may hope to show that after an experimental treatment, two populations will have different means. But the null hypothesis would state that after the treatment, the population's means will not be different. A null hypothesis lets researchers assess whether apparent relationships are genuine or are likely to be a function of change alone. It states the result of the study could easily have happened by change. Statistical tests are used to determine the probability that the null hypothesis is true. If the tests indicate that observed relationship had only a slight probability of occurring by change, the null hypothesis becomes an unlikely explanation and the researcher rejects it. Concisely as possible, a hypothesis should be presented in the form of a concise declarative statement. A complete and concisely stated hypothesis makes clear what the researcher needs to do to test it. If a researcher is exploring more than one relationship, he or she will need to state more than one hypothesis. The general rule is to state only one relationship in any one hypothesis. And then remember that the goals of testability and clarity will be served better by more specific hypotheses. When two hypotheses are of equal explanatory power, prefer the simpler one because it will provide the necessary explanations with fewer assumptions and variables to be defined. And then remember that this principle of parsimony is important in evaluating hypotheses. The last from me is the research hypothesis. A research hypothesis states the relationship one expects to find as a result of the research. It may be a statement about the expected relationship or the expected difference between the variables in the study. A hypothesis about children's IQs and anxiety in the classroom could be stated there is a positive relationship between IQ and anxiety in elementary school children, or children classified as having high IQs will exhibit more anxiety in the classroom than children classified as having low IQs. Research hypotheses may be stated in a directional or non-directional form. A directional hypothesis states the direction of the predicted relationship or difference between the variables. A directional hypothesis is stated when one has some basis for predicting a change in the stated direction. Thanks from me.
Introduce myself. My name is Winda Dwi Aryani. Testing the hypothesis. When researchers speak of testing a hypothesis, however, they are referring to the null hypothesis. Only the null hypothesis can be directly tested by statistical procedure. State the null hypothesis. Select a research method that will enable the hypothesized relationship to be observed if it is there. Gather the empirical data and select and calculate appropriate descriptive statistic for this data. Calculate inferential statistic to determine the probability that your obtained result could have occurred by chance when the null hypothesis is true. If the probability of the observed findings being due to chance is very small, one would have sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Their predictions are not supported by the data. Many beginning researchers believe that if the data they collect do not support their hypothesis, then their study is a failure. Darwin wrote, I have steadily endeavored to keep my mind free so as to give up any hypothesis, however much beloved, as soon as facts are shown to be opposite to it. Indeed, I have had no choice but to act in this manner, for with the exception of the coral reefs, I cannot remember a single first formed hypothesis which had not after a time to be given up or greatly modified, although you might find support for a hypothesis. The hypothesis is not proved to be true. Classroom example of testing a hypothesis. A teacher is interested in investigating reinforcement theory in the classroom. From her understanding of reinforcement theory, this teacher hypothesized that teacher positive comment on student papers will lead to greater achievement. After getting permission from parents or guardians for the children to participate, the teacher would select students to be randomly assigned to the experimental and control group. For those students in the experimental group, she would write positive comment on their papers, whereas the student assigned to the control group would receive no comment. After completing the specified unit, the teacher would administer a common and of unit test to both groups and derive average achievement score on the test for each group. The quantitative research plan. Developing this tentative research. The quantitative research plan. Developing this tentative research plan is essential because it forces you to set down ideas in a concrete form. In a research method class, for example, the professor will certainly need to see what research students are planning. Another point to keep in mind is that the more complete and detailed the initial proposal, the more useful it will be to the researchers and the more time may be saved later. Problem. The plan began with a clear statement of the research problem. A quantitative problem asks about the relationship between specified variables, include the rationale for the study and a brief description of the background of the problem in theory and or related research. hypothesis, a quantitative question, is followed by a concise statement of the research hypothesis. Include the proposed research design, the population of concern, the sampling procedure, the measuring instrument, and any other information relevant to the conduct of the study. Data analysis indicate how you will analyze the data to test the hypothesis and or answer the research question. Beginning, quantitative researchers might find it difficult to write this section because they are not yet familiar with statistics. You might look at the related literature to determine what type of statistical analysis other researchers use, or you might consult with your professor or an expert in statistics.